Thank you, Janet. When it comes to new things, I have kind of mixed feelings. For example, this past week marked the beginning of a new school year, and I can't begin to imagine how many children just in this area, even in Guilford County schools, began a brand new school year, among other things, with a brand new pair of shoes. I mean, there are a lot of shoes that have been bought for kids over these past recent weeks as school is getting ready to begin. And I remember what it was like, whether it was at the beginning of school or just at some point as you needed them, to be able to get a new pair of shoes growing up. And I really loved that because when you get them there, they look so good, they feel so good. There's not a line, a mark, a mar. There's nothing at all that's a problem with them. And I loved it. And you'd be so excited to get to school the next day after you've gotten them to let your friends see them, and hopefully maybe somebody will notice them. Anyway, I really loved and appreciated having that new pair of shoes. However, you felt like you had to kind of guard them, right? I mean, because you were afraid of scuffing them. You were afraid of getting too close to something and marring them in some way. And God forbid if you actually did. I mean, that first black mark, that first scuff, that first nick on a brand new pair of shoes, you just kind of wanted to cry, didn't you? I mean, you just felt terrible. It just ruined your day. These perfectly good-looking, these perfectly brand new-looking shoes, now that they have been sullied. But it doesn't take too long. After you've got the first nick or scratch or scuff, the next one doesn't bother you so much, and the one after that doesn't bother you so much, and so that finally you've got a pair of shoes that, I mean, you just put them on, you don't give any thought to them, and that's kind of nice, isn't it? But that's not just true with shoes, it's also true with cars. For example, the car I drive, it's a 2005 Honda Accord, and when we bought it, it was brand new, and we were so tickled to get that, and there wasn't a scratch, dent, ding, mar, nothing at all. I mean, it was just in perfect shape, and we had not had it very long, and I'm not sure what store I had gone to. This is back when we were in Charlotte, but I came back out to the car, and on the rear driver's door, there was this little ding where somebody either hit it with their car door or with a buggy. And I was furious, but I mean, there's nothing I can do. And I'm just kind of sick as I look at it. I can't believe this perfectly good-looking car now has this ding in the door. And it just hangs over your day, hangs over your mind like a storm cloud, and it's just lousy. As wonderful it is to have that new car, it really stinks when you get that first little ding in it. You get that first scratch, you get that first nick, you get that first problem. And then the same is true on the inside. When everything is spotless and clean and nice, the first time you spill something or drop something in there, oh, you just hate that. But then the next time, it doesn't feel so bad, and the time after that, so that finally you get to a point where your car kind of looks like mine, where it appears, it's not, but it appears that vagrants, not living all the time, but at least part of the week in my car is what it looks like is going on. And so like if I were to go out there now, if there's a little ding in the door, I would wonder, what did that happen today, or is that always been there? Or if something were to get onto one of the mats in the car, if I were to get in with some muddy feet and all of a sudden notice that something is on the carpet, I would say, is that new, or has that been there for 6 years? I just don't know. And because of that, a scratch, a mar, any type of problem like that, it doesn't bother me. If you've got shoes that you've worn for a while, it doesn't bother you when anything happens to them. When you've got an older car that's got some imperfections, it doesn't bother you anymore. And as good as it is and as nice as it is to have something new, it feels a lot better oftentimes, though, to have something old when stuff doesn't bother you, doesn't it? That's kind of nice. That's kind of refreshing. It feels good not to be bothered. Last week we began a series of messages that I've entitled A Matter of Conscience. And we began talking about this blessing that God has afforded us and how it is that He has made us, and giving us this internal sense of right and wrong that every person comes into the world with. Now that doesn't mean that it registers with every possible thing in life, but there are some basic parameters that we come into this world with, etched in our hearts, in this thing that we know as a conscience that functions in many ways like our other senses. And just as your sense of touch can say that something is hot, your sense of conscience can say, hey, you shouldn't do that. That feels wrong. That's out of bounds. Should do this, you should not do that. And one of the things that we will use in terms of a statement concerning our conscience is this. We will say sometimes, my conscience is bothering me. You've said that, haven't you? If you haven't said it, you've thought it, and you've certainly experienced it. You've done something where your conscience bothers you. Let me ask you this. Does that feel good? I mean, do you wake up in the morning and say, man, I would love for my conscience just to bother me today. That would be wonderful. That's what I want to do today. I mean, who needs care winds? I want my conscience to bother me. No, we would put that in the adverse feeling. We would put that in the negative category. It does not feel good when our conscience bothers us. We don't like to be bothered. We don't like to be bothered by our shoes being messed up, our car being messed up, and candidly, we don't like being bothered when our conscience says that we have messed up. So is it possible that we can effectively press the mute button or turn up the squelch so that our conscience doesn't bother us? Can that happen, and should we want it to happen? The Bible answers that question for us today in a passage of Scripture that you'll find in 1 Timothy chapter 4. If you would look with me in your Bibles there today, 1 Timothy chapter 4. 1 Timothy chapter 4, we're going to start with verse 1. So this is a letter. It's known as a pastoral letter, as Paul is writing to Timothy, kind of like a son in the ministry to him, to offer some guidance and some instruction and some encouragement. And he says to Timothy in verse 1 of chapter 4, 1 Timothy, the Spirit explicitly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith. So you've got people that at least seem to be or had aligned themselves with Jesus, with the things of God. They've put on seemingly a Christian jersey. They've aligned themselves with the faith. But then he says some will depart from the faith, and they will do so because of this reason. They are paying attention to deceitful spirits and the teaching of demons. Now, hold up there for a moment. Have you ever known somebody that maybe used to see, at one point seemed as though this is a person that's really serious about the things of God, this is a really committed believer, this is somebody that's serious about following Jesus, and then they no longer are? When they seemed to kind of step away, was it because of this, that they wanted to pay attention to deceitful spirits through the teaching of demons? Has anybody ever come to you and said, I don't think I'm going to go to church anymore because I would rather follow what a demon says? I've got this new class that a demon has been working with me on, and he's been teaching me a lot. So, I'm through with the whole Jesus thing. I'm going to go to the whole demon study. That hasn't happened. So you've got these individuals, Paul says to Timothy, they're going to walk away from the faith so that they might follow demonically authored teachings, following deceitful spirits. Now, they won't know that. They won't be aware that they are following demonically authored teaching. They won't be aware or mindful of the fact that they're heading away from God as opposed to Him. But the reason for it is because of what we read in verse 2. It will happen because of the hypocrisy of liars whose consciences are seared. So there are going to be people who are led astray, that are going to follow demonic teachings, following deceitful spirits, and they will be led astray because there will be individuals that are teaching them things that are not true. They're going to present themselves as people aligned with God, but it's an act. It's pretend. It's hypocritical. They're liars. And they're liars who are teaching this stuff, and they're able to teach this stuff because, Paul says, their consciences are seared. And how do we know that? He says they forbid marriage, and they demand abstinence from food that God created to be received with gratitude by those who believe and know the truth. All right, the operative phrase in these few verses for us to give thought to this morning, though, is where he says and uses the phrase, consciences are seared. In fact, some of your translations will render it as being seared with a hot iron. So, a seared conscience. What in the world is that? And even if you don't know exactly what it is or how it occurs, you've got to recognize that certainly context communicates to us this is not a positive thing. A seared conscience is not something you ought to put on your to-do list, correct? So what we want to think about is this idea of experiencing how you wind up with a seared conscience and seeing that it's a bad thing, how it is that we can avoid it. All right, what's interesting, though, is what you see in verse 2, where Paul uses this phrase, the liars of those whose consciences are seared. The word that's translated as seared, and the Greek is a word, you pronounce it this way, kosteriazo. Kosteriazo. It's the word that gives us, in English, our term cauterize. Cauterize. You might be familiar with that. Even if you're not a surgeon, you may be aware of that term, to cauterize something. I remember when I was in college, my first year there at Gardner Webb, my freshman year, I had a roommate for, a few months early on in that year, where we didn't live together very long. We didn't hit it off. We didn't fight or fuss or feud. We were just so profoundly different. And I believe that we both did things that got on each other's nerves. But one of the things that he did is that he constantly wanted to watch this show. I don't know if it used to be on the Learning Channel or something like that. It was called The Operation. And it was a very simple show. They would show operations being done. And I don't know, in those months that I was with him, I saw all kinds of surgeries. I saw appendectomies, I saw gallbladder removals, I saw brain surgery, I saw open heart surgery. The worst one was to correct scoliosis, when they were working on somebody's spine and attaching these long rods, and it was just terrible. Anyway, this guy, his name was Chris, he used to love to watch The Operation. And I didn't want to fuss and fight over what was going to be on the TV or not, so I would just kind of sit there and endure this. And I watched all of these surgeries take place. And repeatedly, what I would see is that you would have surgeons that would cauterize tissue. Now, you may be aware of how that works. That is, you've got this device that produces such heat that it will burn tissue. It will burn tissue. Now, here's the question. Why would a doctor want to cauterize any tissue? Well, because they want to stop something as they're working in a surgical field. They want to stop some bleeding. In fact, sometimes they would even use a cauterizing knife to cut through fatty tissue. And that heat, what it would do is that it would burn the ends of these little small blood vessels and capillaries so that you're not getting all this excessive blood going into an area where you're operating. That's a good thing because it stops all this excessive bleeding. It helps the surgeon's field of view. Everything about it is a positive thing. But this is what I want you to understand. Cauterizing, when a surgeon does that, is stopping something that should otherwise occur. To cauterize is to stop something that should naturally occur. Now you take that and plug that back into what Paul is saying to Timothy. He's saying to Timothy, there are some guys that are teaching false doctrine, and they're doing so and able to continue doing so because their consciences have been seared. Which is to say that this internal warning system that is sending off all kinds of bells and whistles, all kinds of stop signs, all kinds of warnings, that is not happening because the conscience has effectively been cauterized. What it should do, it's not doing. Cauterizing stops normal function. And so the normal function of the conscience has been interrupted. Is that a good thing? Certainly it's not a good thing. It's a bad thing. Again, we talked last week, and I just reviewed with you a moment ago, this conscience is this internal warning system that God has given to every single one of us. To save people, to lost people, every person comes into this world with this internal sense of basic morality, of basic things that are right and wrong. But it is possible to cause the normal function of the conscience to stop. You can effectively cauterize it. Well, how can that occur? Paul answers that question in verse 3. He describes it by forbidding marriage and demanding abstinence from food that God created. We say, well, really, that's the only way you can sear your conscience is to forbid marriage and to say you can't eat some stuff? What I want you to realize is that Paul is giving to Timothy, in this specific case, some very specific information. But behind the specifics are some principles that are instructive to us that communicate how the conscience can effectively be seared, how it can be muted, how it can be squelched, or even cauterized. Notice how the first thing that he describes. He says, you've got these liars, their consciences are seared, and he says that the first way that you can tell this is because they, in this specific case, they are forbidding marriage. They are forbidding marriage. And so they are saying to people, in essence, this. Listen, if you want to be on God's team, if you want to achieve real spirituality, if you want to achieve a new level or the ultimate level of enlightenment, then you're going to need to be a single person. Perpetual singleness is the ultimate spiritual ideal. Getting married, having children, avoid that at all cost. All right? That's essentially what they were saying. Now, bear with me in mind this reality. At the end of the day, marriage is what we can describe as a pre-political institution, which is to say that marriage existed before any organized state or government recognized it. In fact, contrary to popular belief, the state does not recognize or determine marriage. The only thing that the state can do is to identify it and either confer to it recognition and blessings or not. Here's the question. When did marriage start? Did it start when a government or a municipality or a clerk of court recognized it? No. I mean, those of us who have the rest of the story know that marriage began at the beginning when God created man and woman. When he put Adam and Eve in the garden, that is when marriage began, as you have a husband and a wife. It took many years later before you had organized governmental structures that would codify this, that would recognize it, but God established marriage. This was His idea. So let me ask you this. If marriage was and is God's idea, if He's the one who authored this, and if He's the one who has decided this is the plan of how family life is to operate, and all family life is to be built on this, how do you think God feels about marriage? I mean, God is a cheerleader of it. I mean, God is the biggest fan of marriage. After all, it is His idea. Marriage is God's ideal for how it is that family is to operate. So that being said, Paul is saying to Timothy, listen, there are going to be people that are saying to people that you're ministering to, that's not right, that's wrong. What you need to pursue is not marriage, pursue singleness. Marriage is a bad thing. In that specific lies a principle. And the principle is this. You have these individuals whose consciences get seared because they decide this. My plans are the one that matter. How I think things should operate, my designs, those are the ones that should ultimately matter. Again, you have marriage, which is God's idea, that is God's plan. And then you have these individuals who are described this way. Their consciences are seared. And what are they saying? No, pay no attention to that. Perpetual singleness, that is the ultimate ideal. So what they are doing is effectively saying, hey, how we say things, how I say things should operate, what my designs, what my intentions are, what my plans and purposes are, those are the things that ultimately matter. What I want you to realize, though, is that every single person comes into this world with a conscience, with this basic sense of morality etched into our hearts. That, among other things, how it is that God has wired us is that members of the opposite sex would come together in a committed relationship that would become the foundation for the family itself. And you have people in the first century saying, no, that's not how it should work. That's not how it should work at all. But the truth is, in the 21st century, you have plenty of people saying today, that's not how it should work. Candidly, in clear violation of conscience. Let me just give you a statistic. NBC News reported these numbers. Based on the 2010 census figures. So bear in mind, these numbers are 8 years old now. So they won't be formally updated until 2020. In the United States, couples living together outside of marriage number over 15 million people. So you hear that number and say, well, 15 million. That sounds like a lot of people, and it is a lot of people, but let me give you a little bit of context about 15 million. There are only 4 states in the United States that number more than 15 million people. California, Texas, Florida, and New York. So out of 50 states, 46 of them have less than 15 million people. In fact, 46 of them have less than 13 million people. So there are more, pick any state in the United States except for 4 of them, and there are more people, more couples living together outside of marriage than all but 4 states. That's kind of crazy, isn't it? It's mind-boggling. What I would say to you, though, is that we have this going on at such enormous numbers, at such level, and that occurs in violation of how we come into this world thinking that family life ought to operate. How do we get to that point? Because if you tell yourself something long enough, over and over and over again, you finally get to the point where you just kind of believe it. And if your conscience is saying, you know, I shouldn't do this, this is out of bounds, this is not appropriate, this is not right, if you keep doing it over and over and over and over again, what it effectively does is to sear the conscience. It causes what normally and should naturally work to actually stop functioning. So you have these individuals that are described as those whose consciences are seared, and it gets to that point because they say, my plans are the ones that matter. But there's something else they do. He says, they demand abstinence from foods that are created to be received with gratitude by those who believe and know the truth. All right, so keep this in mind. The conscience comes as a gift from God to everyone. It is not the Holy Spirit and is therefore not perfect, but nevertheless, we come into this world with this basic awareness of some things that are right and some things that are wrong. And God gives us this conscience as a great gift with the intention that we actually pay attention to it. And the conscience gets seared over time, where we raise the red flag and we ignore it, saying, you know what, I get to determine what is right. I am the one that gets to determine what is appropriate. It's my rules, it is my approval that ultimately matters. We don't have time to fully unpack everything that Paul is saying to Timothy here relative to food, but what I want you to understand is this. At this point, God has even removed the designation between clean and unclean foods. And so you've got what he says, that God has given these foods that are created to be received with gratitude by those who believe and know the truth. So God has given all of this food. He's given all this stuff that people may eat. And you've got some individuals that are saying, no, you cannot eat those things. I hope it was like nasty stuff like Brussels sprouts and like pork rinds and stuff like that, but we don't know exactly what it was that they were forbidding. But you have a group of people that are saying, oh, no. True spiritual enlightenment, spiritual maturity is achieved by having nothing to do with these things. Things that God has approved. Things that God has said, those are okay. These are things that you ought to receive and say, thank God for. I have this because this comes as a blessing from God. But Paul says to Timothy, listen, you've got some people that are telling people, that's not right. You You don't need to pay attention to what God has made clear, either through His expressed word, or even pay attention to what He has communicated in the hearts of people. You need to pay attention to our standard. That there's these foods that you absolutely must stay away from, that you need to completely abstain from, and that's the rule. And so what they're trying to do is this. They're trying to establish rules that God did not even author. They're trying to say, ultimately, it's what I say that matters, not what God has communicated to me, and not even what God has communicated to me through my conscience. The phrase again is this: their consciences are seared. It's not doing what it should normally do. It's not sending off whistles and bells. There's no red lights and stop signs. These liars are perpetrating this hoax on many people, causing them to abandon the truth and to walk away from the gospel. And it's occurring because they are individuals who have gotten to a point where they've decided, you know what? I don't need to pay attention to these warnings inside. I'm going to ignore them, and they do this over time, thinking, you know what, how I think things should work. My plans are the ones that matter, and ultimately my rules are the ones that matter. Don't need to pay attention to conscience. Don't need to pay attention to what God has said. It's my rules are the ones that matter. If you pay much attention, you can see that in particular at work in a lot of places, in a lot of people's lives. I can share this story now because I think all the players now at this point are dead, but it's probably 16 years ago. I was in my first year or so of pastoring, and there was this couple where they were older, and I knew them to be dating, and they didn't specifically say. They were always kind of together. People had said to me that those two that they're dating, they've been together for quite a while. And I didn't really know their story, apart from the fact that I knew that the man had been married before. I didn't know about her. I knew that he had been married before, had at least a child, and just kind of figured, in the winter years of life, or just enjoying each other's company and that type of thing. And so I didn't give a whole lot of thought to it until one day, the man, I'll just call him Joe, that's not his name, but Joe comes to me, and he is livid because a church member has asked him if he and this lady are living together. And I had heard people ask that question before, and I didn't know, and I didn't trouble myself to ask the question at that point with him. And so, but he just, out of the gate, he was just so defiant. Oh, absolutely not, absolutely not. But strangely, like 2 weeks later, they're gone on a Sunday, and they come back the following week, and they've been down to Georgia, and they've got married. So it's like somebody has said, oh, are you living together? Oh, absolutely not. And then strangely, they come back married. Anyway, so I didn't give a whole lot of thought to it, but, I'm not working on some inquisition or anything. And so they're, in the winter years of life, newlyweds. I don't know, it's probably a couple of months after that. I am headed to lunch with some church members, and my secretary calls me, and she says, Joe is dead. Joe didn't have any health problems. He had not been sick. He had not been in the hospital. He was doing fine. He had been at church the day before. As I recall, this was on a Monday. And she told me which hospital he was in. And so I took these others that I was with. I dropped them off, and I headed to the hospital. And I raced to find where the now widow is. And she's absolutely stunned. I mean, this has come to her like a cannonball into her chest. She's just heartbroken, so devastated. This came out of nowhere. And so she's explaining to me some of the specifics as to what has happened that morning that led them to come to the hospital and then for him to just die. And at that point, she says, hey, do you want to go in? They've told me I can go back in there. Do you want to go in with me and see him again? Well, I have been at the bedside of more people than I can count, of those who have died or take their last breath. I've been around a lot of non-living people, and that doesn't bother me. It's not something I'm like itching to experience, but that doesn't bother me. And so I said, no, I'll be glad to go in there with you. And bear in mind, I have seen tons of folks dead before and tons of folks since. But I remember distinctly, and to this day it is as clear as a bell, when we walked into that room and I saw, again, I'm just going to call him Joe, Joe's body laying there, the look on his face, I am not lying to you, it is as if the screeching sound of a horror film goes off in my mind. I mean, it is a absolutely terrified, petrified look on his face that I've never seen on another deceased person before or since. And I've seen a lot of them. Anyway, I don't say anything to the widow about this, and so we stand there. She strokes his head for a moment, and she says kind of her final goodbyes before she has to go to the nurse's station and sign the paperwork for the funeral home to come and get the body. And so we leave that room, and she asks me if I would call his son and let him know that Joe was dead. I knew Joe was from another state. I knew the son was out of state. I said, yeah, you get me the number, I'll call him. And so she looks, and she's able to find the number, and I call the son. So I'm there at this point, I've gotten back to her house. And the son answers the phone, and I had to tell him that his father had died. And so we talked for a few moments, and then he asks me, have you told my mother? And I said, no, I didn't know with a divorce and all what the status of their relationship was. And this was his question. What divorce? To make a long story short, what had happened is that this man and his wife had moved from out of state to Charlotte. And at some point, she had decided she was going to go back home to help her mother or something like that. And he was going to return after he settled some business affairs or whatever. But he just kind of stayed. And days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, months turned into years. And he just kind of stayed in Charlotte. And somewhere along the way, he met this other lady. I think she was cutting his hair, and they became closer and closer and closer and closer. Nobody knew what was going on back out of state. But it turns out this guy didn't have just one wife, he had two. In fact, the day that he died, he did what he did every morning, which was on his way to work, call the out-of-state wife. He would tell wife in Charlotte, I'm going back to see my son. Well, he would go see his son and wife number one. 3 days later, I have both wives sitting in my office planning two separate funerals. Let me just tell you, they don't teach you how to deal with that in seminary. Anyway, so I am helping at this point, these two women who are now victims of somebody that was absolutely living a lie. Somebody that was absolutely perpetrating a hoax. Somebody who was absolutely pretending. My thought during that time, and even now as I think back on it, goes back to that day in the hospital. And goes back to that moment when I walked into that hospital room and saw his lifeless body in that bed. And at that point, and I will never know for sure this side of heaven, but once the curtain got kind of pulled back in terms of the truth, that horrified look on his face seemed to make a bit more sense. And I don't know, I will never know for certain, but if I'm a guessing man, if I'm a betting man, there are two thoughts that I believe went through his mind as he breathed his last. The gig is up, and it's not ultimately my rules that ultimately matter. I wondered how this guy could do this for so long. I wondered how this could go on for a period of years. I wondered how in the world he could lie in bed at night, regardless of which wife was with him, and be able to sleep and go to bed and sleep at night. How in the world could that happen? And the only thing I could conclude is this is a man with a seared conscience. And over time, he told himself, oh, this isn't so bad. This isn't so wrong. This isn't such a bad thing. And I believe that he told himself that over and over and over and over again until finally he got to a point where he was just kind of okay with it. That was life. That was normal. But I'm betting those last couple of thoughts, the gig is up, and it's not ultimately my rules that matter. Seared consciences are not hard to find. And you don't have to go looking for somebody that is a polygamist to find it. It's entirely possible, if not in fact likely, that there's folks sitting here today with a seared conscience. Part of how God has wired you, that's not working because over and over and over and over and over again, it takes some time, but it doesn't take a lot of time. But some time passes where you keep suppressing this internal warning system that God has given to you, that's rooted in plans and designs that God has, and you tell yourself over and over again, those plans don't matter, mine do. Repeated warnings of your conscience saying, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, and you say, you know what, it's ultimately my approval that matters. I get to say, and it's my rules that ultimately matter. You say that to yourself over and over and over and over again, and you suppress it and you suppress it and suppress it and suppress it. And it's almost as if you're using a hot cauterizing knife, and what should be working, what should be functioning, that natural function simply ceases. In Paul's day, this is how it was working. You may be able to say, not simply in the 21st century, but even in your experience, this is how it works. This is what it looks like. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a surgeon, don't pretend to be one, but I am aware of this. I watched enough of the operation on TV. Once the surgery is complete and the surgeon has finished whatever he or she needs to do, they're going to bring those tissues back together. And they're going to use staples, they're going to use sutures, they're going to use something to bring that tissue back together. And one of the goals is this, that healing is going to occur, and not simply will disjointed tissue come back together, but so too will those vessels, those arteries, those little capillaries, that blood flow, that cauterizing stopped, might begin to flow again, so that normal function might be restored. Cauterizing does not have to be and should not be irreversible. It can be restored. Some of you might have experienced a seared, cauterized conscience. Do you need the Lord to bring you back together today? Will you bow your heads with me? It is entirely possible, as I have talked in some general terms, that there are some specifics that have come to your mind about your circumstances and your choices, even as of late. And it's causing you to think some things and to think about some things, and how you feel about that. It doesn't feel good. It's kind of unpleasant. But that's God's gift to you to let you know there's a problem. Maybe for you the problem has been that you have been operating exactly like some of these false teachers did in Paul's day. Telling yourself over and over again, it doesn't make any difference what God has said. I'm the trump card. It's my plans. It's my rules that matter. And bit by bit, day by day, week by week, you have been squelching and muting that conscience to the point where stuff that used to bother you, it doesn't bother you anymore. You're able to come and sit in the pew of a sanctuary, of a Christian church, grateful that people around you don't know what has been going on behind the scenes this week. Grateful that others don't know exactly what has been occurring, because that would bother you. But you slept well last night. You slept well the night before that. Maybe because stuff that used to bother you no longer does, because your conscience has become seared. Are you willing to do something today? And that's to say, Lord, I need you to be the great physician to my conscience. I need you to bring together some things that have been disjointed. I need you to restore some function that has been lost because of choices that I've made. I know being bothered doesn't feel good, but being bothered is a good thing, because it is for my good that my conscience shows me the boundaries I should operate in. Are you willing to do that this morning? Maybe you want to do so kneeling in prayer at this altar. Maybe you want me to pray with you. Maybe you just want to do it where you are right now. The thing that matters most is that you do it. Will you do that? Maybe it is this morning that you're kind of bothered about the fact that there's things you know about God, there's things you know about the Bible and Jesus, but you cannot say with a clear conscience, hey, I've got a personal relationship with Him. He's made a difference in my life. He's made a difference in where I'm going to spend eternity. We would love to help you settle that. We'd love for you to be able to come and experience a decision that I and so many others here have already made. Will you make that today? Will you take that step? Allow us to come alongside you and help you. Maybe today is the day that you believe and know that God has led you to Gate City so that you've been able to discover in the weeks and the months that have gone by, this is a place that He wants you to invest your life, to use your gifts, to use your talents as part of the church family. Maybe there's some other burden that's on your heart that God wants you to leave with Him today. He's spoken because He wants you to respond. My hope is that you will. God, we want to say what you know to be true, and we are certain of as well, and that is that every one of us is screw-ups. And we mess up repeatedly, and unfortunately, in doing so, that can happen enough times where we even deceive ourselves and suppress automatic warning systems that you've wired us with, so that things that should bother us don't. Lord, for those that have and are on that path, I pray that you guide them, that you motivate them, that you convict them in such a way that they decide, Lord, I need you to heal what's broken inside of me. And that because of the changes and because of the decisions that we each make today, Lord, that we leave this place differently. God, that's our prayer, and we commit this time decision to you in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to ask you if you would to stand, and as God has spoken to your